happy to be here tonight. So for those who don't know me, my name is Jessica. I host Products That Count in San Jose for 2019. And a bit of background about me, I lead product at a fintech startup called Earnin. We're a Series C company that's focused on fighting unfairness in the financial space. So helping folks get access to their pay before payday. And also a little bit about Products That Count for those who are new here. This was a community that was founded by SC Moati back in 2014, so it's been a little while. We're a community of about 20,000 product managers, all focused on sort of engaging around this topic of building amazing products. And it's fundamentally a speaker series in 5 different cities throughout the United States. As well as a podcast now, and it's expanded to awards, product awards, and so we're definitely growing really fast. So thanks so much for being part of the community and for being here. So I wanted to also, before we jump into the talk today, take the time to thank Adobe for having us in this amazing space. Pam, would you like to come up and say a few words?
Thank you. I'm Pam Clark. I run product for Photoshop here at Adobe. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoy the event tonight. And Adobe is hiring product managers, engineers, and designers, all functions basically. And so if you are interested, if you are a product manager who's looking for a job, or an engineer or know an engineer, particularly if you're an iOS engineer. I always give people here my email address. You're welcome to email me. I'm Pam, P-A-M, @adobe.com, so you can remember it. And welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Great, and so really quick overview of what's to come tonight. So as you guys probably have discovered, that pizza and drinks are behind the wall over there. Thank you again for Adobe for that. So we'll have Nick come up, give the talk. You guys should be receiving in your emails pretty shortly after the talk an NPS survey. This is pretty valuable to both us and the speaker to be able to really calibrate and make sure that the talks that we're putting on are super high value and we continue to find really, really great people. There's going to be, please save your questions until after the talk, and then so we'll have the speaker come up and give the talk, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. A quick shout out. So then after that, we'll have time about just a few minutes for shout outs. And shout outs are this thing that's pretty unique to Products That Count. A few second snippet of whatever you like to share with the community. So if anybody here is looking for a job, looking to hire, looking to sell your product, whatever it is, feel free to jump up and share a shout out. For the first person who gives a shout out, there's a small prize. So be thinking about that while the talk is happening. The other thing to mention, please, after the event, please remember to clean up after yourselves. Adobe is very graciously providing us a space, so just throw away any of the food and drinks and stuff in the trash cans. And afterwards, there should be a little bit of time if you guys have any follow-up questions that weren't covered in the initial session. So that's pretty much the logistics. And then I am super excited to be welcoming Nick here tonight to speak. Nick heads up product and design at change.org. He's been there for, I think, almost 8 years, which is a very, very long time. He and I met a few months ago at a product event, and I remember at that time that he had just incredible learnings to share. And so when I started hosting this, he was one of the first folks who came to mind as somebody who would have a lot of valuable insights to share with the community. So I'm super, super glad that he agreed to come. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Thanks.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. Quick hands up. How many people here have signed a petition on change.org? And how many of you continue to subscribe? Yeah, it's really good to be here. I'm excited to share a few learnings from our last couple of years that have been particularly interesting, because I don't have the most traditional of product backgrounds, and because Change.org is not the most traditional of startups. I wanted to start by giving you just like 2 minutes of context, quickly letting you know where I come from and also a little bit of the story of Change before I talk a little bit more about the substance of the topic tonight. My background, my background is I studied law, graduated from law. I quickly realized that if I continued in law, then I would be depressed for life. I got out of law. I became a full-time activist. I worked on climate campaigning and working to influence policy around extreme poverty. I led a Make Poverty History campaign in Australia for several years, secured several $1 billion for policy changes around extreme poverty work. My first product work was co-founding this campaign called Live Below the Line, which challenged people to live on underneath $2 a day for 5 days and raise money for fighting extreme poverty. And about 50,000 people have done that campaign now. We've raised about $15 million over the years. That was the first time I got into the product side of the work. And then several years ago, I joined Change.org. So Change.org, for those of you who don't know, our mission is to empower people everywhere to create the change they want to see. A lot of people use us. We have close to 100 million monthly users. About 40,000 campaigns are started on the site every month. And that is everything from the hyper-local, please don't chop down this tree in my local park, to there are these extraordinarily horrifying human rights abuses happening in some part of the world, and we're trying to bring a lot of attention to those. And Change hosts everything in between, as well as a whole bunch of stuff that you wouldn't expect. Back when Change started, we started as a toolkit for activism of all kinds. And in addition to having this glorious word cloud, I'm very sad that those went out of fashion. You'll see that we tried to pretty much do everything. We have groups here, we have fundraising, we have messages, there are pages for politicians, there are pages for nonprofits. We're kind of trying to do everything under the sun. And one of the things that we had was petitions, and somewhat to our surprise, we noticed that those petitions were both one of the most popular features for people to take action, but not only were they one of the most popular features, entirely to our surprise, they were winning. We had dozens and then hundreds of mayors and corporate PR people and CEOs calling our offices. I remember being in our DC office in 2012. This is before I moved to the States. As you can tell, I'm hopefully originally from Australia. And the phone was ringing in our office, and I picked it up, and there was this very angry head of PR for some big company that was like, there is this petition which has 100 signatures on it that is calling us out for our supply chain practices. Please take it down. I was like, why would we do that? And we ended up having a negotiation. It turned out that this petition went on to win. And so after having this insight, both from users and from the way that these petitions actually were starting to generate some level of societal impact, we decided to double down on that. And we, in the course of 2 weeks, we gutted the site, focused entirely on petitions, and said, this is what we're going to focus around. We're going to make activism as simple, accessible, and easy to be part of as possible. And that's what we're going to do really well. So pretty soon, we started seeing petitions like this one. So you might remember Trayvon Martin. He was a young man who was walking in a predominantly white neighborhood, went to the corner store to buy some Skittles, and he was shot and killed by a guy who claimed stand your ground defense for confronting him in a way that kind of then led to him dying. And Trayvon's parents started a petition on Change.org back when no one was paying attention to this story. they were desperate. There was no one doing anything. They felt like their son was just going to be another nameless statistic, and they launched this campaign. This campaign went viral, unsurprisingly. This is a really powerful story. This is a really horrific injustice. And the way that their story took off and the way that it cut through and spread, it catalyzed a cloud of media, which catapulted this story to the kind of front of the national conversation around race, around justice. It led to the killer being prosecuted, though not actually convicted. But it led to this ongoing conversation around race in America that continues in many ways to this day. We started seeing more and more campaigns like this coming up on the site, where these otherwise unknown stories were being told in a way that catapulted them into a national spotlight and led to some level of change. So my first job at Change.org was not in product. My background is in campaigning. And as a campaigner, one of the unique parts of our model is that we created a team of people who would provide wraparound support for campaigns like this. So it was my job, first in Australia and then around the world, to work with people like Trayvon's parents and provide all of these things: political strategy, media training and PR, marketing and viral growth advice, lobbying advice and relationships. And we had a team, first of just a few of us, and then over time this grew to more than 100 that would parachute in to these big campaigns and provide this like incubation, acceleration support to help blow these campaigns up and help make them successful. And this model, it really worked. So we kind of built this out as a bit of a playbook, combining this incubation activism with pretty standard kind of growth marketing tactics. And we built that into a playbook for entering new markets. And then over the course of a few years, it was my job to take that to a whole bunch of new markets. We opened up 15 new markets globally over the course of 12 months, which was fun. Probably a mistake. I can get back to that later. And it really paid off from a growth perspective. This is our user growth over time on different languages, kind of growing up towards that 100 million monthly mark. English is at the bottom, and you see how now like Change.org is like the majority of our action is actually happening in Europe at this point, and that continues to grow. Behind all of this, like the revenue model that was powering Change.org was a B2B, essentially lead generation model for nonprofits. So you have people or organizations like No Kid Hungry that wanted to feature their campaigns to people who cared about their issue. Those people would then be able to support those campaigns and would like opt in to hearing more from that organization. And then that organization would recruit more supporters, would try and find donors, volunteers, and so on. This was great. It grew to tens of millions of dollars of revenue over time. And we invested heavily in growing it further. Grew out our sales teams and tried to build out the products to be an even better advertising self-serve model, essentially. Problem is, anyone who relies on online advertising 3 or 4 years ago saw dark clouds on the horizon. The duopoly that is Google and Facebook were having increasingly sophisticated options and targeting, and it made less and less sense for advertisers to spend time on niche offerings. And we noticed that in 2015. We weren't yet suffering in terms of decline or anything, but we noticed that growth was slowing, even though we were investing more and more. And so this was the situation that we found ourselves in a couple of years ago. We had stagnating revenue growth, despite the fact that we were investing more and more in trying to grow it. Because we were trying harder and harder to squeeze like growth out of this model, there was a deteriorating user experience. And all of this was compounded by the fact that we had limited runway, not as much resources to kind of compete with the online advertising space. And we had this little pilot that had been going for a little while, which was maybe giving people a way to promote or support the campaigns they cared about with their own money. It was a more a B2C model rather than a B2B model. But we only had the most initial kind of data that could be in the remotest way interesting. And we had no signs as to whether or not that might grow over time. So we faced this choice. And I'm interested, I want you to think about what choice you would make in this situation. We faced a choice. If we could try and maintain this B2B revenue line, which is worth tens of millions of dollars a year, which would give us more runway to grow this alternative over time and not be directly competing in this space. We could slowly wind down this B2B model while slowly trying to wind up this B2C model. Or we could cut the B2B model entirely, jump off the cliff, start building crazily, and see whether or not we could put something together before we hit the ground. Have a think to yourself. There is no right answer. I'm interested. We went with option C. Not a surprising punchline given the way I set it up, probably. Mainly, we thought that the value of focus and aligning the whole organization with the approach that we were going to take was more likely to succeed, even though it was higher risk. And I took on running product at Change.org rather than working on the campaign side 4 weeks before we made this decision. So that was my introduction to running product at Change.org was, okay, we're cutting the B2B business line. We need to downsize in order to give ourselves runway to do that. So we cut 50% of the team. That was my week 4. And then based on that, we have 2 years to replace more than $20 million of revenue with an entirely unproven business line. At that time, I would say that our team was excruciatingly slow. We had spent a couple of years at this point trying to work on a model that was failing. The team wasn't used to winning. We'd been grinding away at trying to build this business line, consistently missing goals. So people were dispirited, disheartened, and we were a bit bloated as well, honestly. At the time, we started with 100 people across product development. And so what I thought to myself was I only have one chance here. I only get to focus on one thing. As a product leader, what is going to be the highest leverage thing that I can focus on in order to help us get through this process? And I decided that thing was going to be speed. If I could get the team to be blisteringly fast at learning, at shipping, at failing, at winning, that was going to be the lever that I thought could help us kind of get through this process. So that's where I decided to focus. And what followed was a couple of years of very intense times, lots of failures, some successes. And my hope is that over the next couple of minutes, I can share what some of those successes were, and that they can be something that's applicable for you and your organizations. I will say, just as a caveat, this is all in the B2C space. We're operating with a lot of traffic. Some of these things are probably more applicable in that situation than others. I still think that there are abstractable lessons here that can apply across every organization, no matter what type of model it is. And my hope is that that's useful for you. So, first lesson, success means focus. Focus means saying no. This has been a mantra of mine for a long time. I don't think I realized how much it mattered until I was doing this work. This is a feature or product called movements. What this allows you to do is as an organization or as a organizer or campaigning leader, it allows you to collect together a whole lot of campaigns that all share a common goal but might be going about it in different ways. It was basically a kind of meta category that allowed us to combine a number of different efforts and focused them. This is the first change.org native app. It had really great discoverability, had amazing retention numbers. Our team had been working on it for 6 months when it launched, and we had a whole team dedicated to it. We knew that over time, if we were to succeed, we needed to be much more in the mobile native space rather than mobile web, which is what we had been up until that point. This is Change Politics. This is a feature that had also just launched, a product that had just launched. This was third horizon. This was like a big swing for us to kind of enter into the political space. It was a way that you could, it was solving the problem of low information voters. If you were going into a ballot box and didn't know what to vote for, you could follow friends or trusted organisations or institutions to get recommendations about what ballot initiatives or what candidates down the ballot you could follow. We'd piloted it in California in the primary season in 2016, and we were ramping up before the election. All of these were things that we were working on at the point that like I was just talking about. So they all had a few things in common. One, they had like a big vision, and that if they were successful, could be a material upgrade in the product experience and in the way that we provided value for users. Two, they weren't immediate winners. Now, you don't expect most new products to be immediate winners, but they all had like one problem or another. The mobile app had like amazing retention numbers. Acquisition was hard, like getting the install. Anyone who works in mobiles like knows that that's the problem. With Change Politics, similarly, like a lot of engagement once people actually had it. The acquisition was the problem. With movements, getting the creators or the organizers, it was hard to get like enough supply of those. All of these are problems that you kind of expect to solve in working on any new product, but all of them relied on the core Change.org app and experience for solving those problems in a way that was problematic. Every single one of them I killed within 3 months of starting, and the main reason was because of those interdependencies. The more a product or feature is interdependent with like your core experience and like has mediocre success, it introduces an enormous amount of complexity into the work that you're doing. And so I think I only did this because of this like crisis moment that we were in, but I'm very glad that I was forced to, because it helped avoid an enormous amount of complexity. And I think that like this is the number one thing that I want you folks to think about and take away, is that like every mediocre feature or product that you have, every time you leave it there, even though you're like, oh, the easy thing to do is just to kind of leave it on, is all adding to the complexity and cost of doing business and like of building products in a way which slows you down in very hard to measure but very real ways. So whether that's the complexity of users, only if there's some mediocre feature that like is decent, but it's not like a huge winner. Maybe it's like qualitative feedback is like mixed. Maybe the retention numbers are not high. That's like cognitive overhead for users in like not discovering some really delightful feature that could drive retention in really high rates. The code design and decision-making complexity of just like keeping something like that as part of your system is really significant. Designing to make sure that like this feature is maintained, creating the code necessary to make sure that this feature is maintained, even just deciding whether or not to resource it on a regular basis is all overhead for you as a product leader. And then the final thing, complexity within your org. I think this is like one thing that has really struck me through thinking through this process is like the alignment of incentives. Within your organization, everyone has something that they're really invested in. Like the people who worked on that product or feature want it to succeed. The people who maybe there are stakeholders across the organization who really are invested in that feature because it helps them in some certain way. And the more that you leave those things littered around throughout your product, the more they're kind of lobbying opportunities, essentially, which prevent people from focusing on the things that are highest impact for the organization overall. And so my prompt to all of you is that I don't think it's hard to identify what these products or features are. Like literally, I'm sure that like if I kind of took you each aside and said, you have 15 seconds, like what are the top 2 or 3 products or features in your product that are mediocre? I'm sure that you'd each have answers to that question. My prompt to you is like rip the Band-Aid off, make the decision now. And my advice is the way that you get out of a bunch of the pain or avoid a bunch of the pain of people being really frustrated if you deprecating features is that you just give them lots of notice. And you just say, just going to let you know in 6 months' time, this is no longer going to exist. And people will be annoyed, but it defers the pain. And so everyone gets used to it. That's my first thing here. Success means focus. Focus means saying no. And that this is the kind of fundamentals of moving faster. Is like actually like clearing the way for you to be able to focus on the things that are highest impact and highest return, and not be screwing around with the things that are only mediocre and going to be dragging you back. That's the first lesson. Second lesson, alignment. I think this is the number one reason why you would fail. First item is about how you clear the pathway. Second item is like, okay, when you're going along, what's going to trip you over? And I think alignment is the key. Hands up if this conversation is familiar. I wish we would move faster on one hand, and on the other hand, yeah, but we really need to maintain quality. Every time that conversation happens, I think it's a signal that there's a lack of alignment, because I think we get forced into these kind of pigeonholes that are not actually valid. It's not like people who want to move faster don't care about quality. It's not like people who care about quality don't want to move faster, but you kind of get forced into these positions which then make you and leave you arguing in a way which means that, again, you're not focused on what's actually delivering value. So I faced this pretty fast when we killed some products and we said, we're going to focus on being fast. Let's start moving quickly. And very quickly, this conversation arose. Quality versus speed, incremental versus like big swing, big investment features. And so I started thinking about like how is it that we could generate the alignment necessary such that this conversation wasn't coming up regularly. So here's what worked for me. I'm all about stories. Like what are the shared stories that enable a group to be aligned around something? And so for me, the story of like us as an elite soccer team trying to win a game is the thing that worked. So we're like an elite soccer team. We're trying to win a game, and we need to get better at the way we work together in order to win that game. Some people are playing defense. Some people are playing offense. Some people are protecting us from like having goals scored against us. But at the end of the day, unless like we have more goals in the other end of the net, then like we're going to lose. So there are 3 things that matter here. So I spent some time going, what does winning mean for us as a team? And so for us, that was like, all right, we need 200% increase in revenue in the next 6 months. For you, it could be like user growth. It could be account activation. Whatever your like top line metrics are. Like that's what winning looks like. Scoring a goal means like a meaningful increment towards that. So if my top line goal is a 200% increase in revenue in 6 months, then a meaningful increment towards that is a 20% a feature that delivers a 20% increase in revenue during that period of time. And a shot on goal is the smallest amount of work necessary to identify whether or not that feature or MVP or prototype or whatever it is will actually generate that value. So once you define those things, there's a pretty easy funnel that you can get everyone to align around. You can say, all right, we need 200% increase. We need to score 10 goals over the next 6 months. We then have 2 variables that we can focus on. We can focus on the number of shots we take, or we can focus on the quality of those shots, the likelihood that those shots hit the back of the net. You might believe that we can get a 50% strike rate. 50% of the shots that we take will hit the back of the net and will generate a 20% increase in some core metric. Or you might believe that it's like 10%, wherever it is, but like let's draw a line in the sand and predict what we think it is. Whatever that is, that then gives us a formula for what we need to do over the next 6 months. The number of shots on goal that we need to win is 100. All right, now as a team, we need to go, how do we build the muscles necessary for us to be able to deliver 100 shots on goal during that period of time? And then we can start measuring. If it turns out we're getting a goal like 20% of the time rather than 10, then great. We can focus on like 50 shots rather than 100. If it turns out we're only scoring 1% of the time, then we need to get really, really fast. And creating this shared language that everyone could then orient around, and then starting to measure teams by it, where every single team at the start of a quarter, what I would ask is, what's winning look like for your team at the end of the quarter? How many shots do you think you need to take in order to hit it? And justify what your kind of shot to goal ratio is going to be. If you have good evidence for why it's going to be 50%, great, good luck. If it's only going to be 10%, then good. I want to see how you're going to work as a team in order to take 10, 20, 30, 40 shots during this period of time. And I think focusing teams on the outcome then enabled everyone to be pulling in the same direction and stopped dead the conversations around speed versus quality, because everyone was then trying to solve like, all right, our goal is this number of shots. So that worked really well. That started increasing our velocity. The thing is, no matter how well you're doing, you start collecting barnacles as you're going along. You might be very sleek to start with, but no matter where you start, there are things that come along that start slowing you down. Teams start having a bit less alignment over time. And one of the situations that we faced is we generated all these ideas that were well tested, that we thought were going to deliver a lot of value, but our ability to ship those had just started to slow down over time. This was like 9 or 12 months into this process. And so one thing that we decided to try was something called an avalanche. And the avalanche, it basically like starts from the idea that in any given team, you're balancing these different types of work. So there's offensive work, which is creating value for users or the business. And you can be doing that in short, medium, or long horizons. There's defensive work, which is like reacting or protecting the business from various things. So for us, like when the Facebook algorithm changes, then that's like, because we have a lot of viral distribution, that's something that we need to be aware of. That's a defensive action that we take. We deal with a lot of fraudulent stuff, like constantly fighting spammers. We also have a lot of like hateful content. All of that like falls into our defensive work. And generally the team is well spread across all of these things. Like you need to, as a business, be spread across these things in a fairly balanced way. But they all have slightly different interests and incentives. And over time, those build up in a way that like starts to stop a team from working effectively together in a way that's fast. And so the idea of an avalanche is when you get the entire team to focus on just one component of that map. It can be anywhere. So maybe it's short-term shots delivering value. Maybe it's like some big re-architecture that's going to unlock the velocity of the team in some substantial way. The key is that everyone is focused on the same problem, because keeping everyone focused on the same problem for some fixed, short, focused period of time is going to build a muscle around both collaboration and speed that then maintains once everyone goes back to these types of work. And so for us, we found ourselves in a situation where we had all these ideas, all these products that we tested, but we hadn't been able to ship them. And we said, we're just going to stop everything. We're going to focus on short-term shots. We want to just get it all out there. This is our avalanche moment. Everyone is going to be like focused on solving this. And there is a remarkable amount of the slowness of your team is generated by lack of alignment or differing incentives. It's not actually capability, it's just people trying to solve different problems. So when you focus everyone on solving the exact same problem, it's remarkable how fast people can work, and it does carry through as when they go back to their work. So the lessons from this we did this for a 7-week period. We basically took everyone aside and we said, all right, for the next 7 weeks, we're all going to focus on this shared roadmap with this shared goal. So the lessons from this, it's really tempting to not go all in, to kind of say that you're going all in, but to kind of maintain a bunch of stuff in the background. Avoid that like the plague. Really important that you actually clear the decks in a way that allows people to focus, even if it's for a really short period of time. The second thing is don't be afraid of high stakes. People have got to believe that it's important. This isn't about fake goals. This isn't about something that doesn't really matter that much to the business. People have really got to understand why it's worth disrupting the kind of ongoing work practices. It's really important that you set an end date so that people know that there's an end in sight and that they get to go back to their stability. Schedule time afterwards to clean up the mess because you'll generate a lot of mess. And then the final thing is make it fun. So we did this in August, September last year. It was for a 6-week period. And I was like, I don't know what we're going to call this. I want the team to name it. And it got named Oktoberfest. So Oktoberfest was this 7-week period. And once the Oktoberfest name kind of came into being, that meant that suddenly I was showing up to the office in lederhosen against my will. I nominated our COO without him knowing that, if we hit our goals at the end of that period, that he was going to get a tattoo with Oktoberfest on it. That turned into a hair, he shaved his head and had it stenciled into his head. We had a gong that would ring every time someone shipped something as part of the October. You can turn this into something that isn't kind of a threat or challenging. It's actually this great period where everyone gets to work on the same thing. And you had this great moment where you had people first year, second year engineers working with the CTO on some really interesting product or feature that they would never otherwise do. And so this process in general lasted for 6 weeks. We did this in September, October last year. It built all these muscles that have now carried through and continue to. I expect us to do another one in the next couple of quarters because I think it's a healthy way of everyone working on a common problem and building those muscles in a way that's durable. That's Avalanches. Feedback. So this is how to accelerate. This is my final thought. First, whenever you win, you need to shout that from the rooftops. I think this is fairly well understood, but every time a team was starting to generate value as a result of some of these shots, we would share it on everything from all team calls to weekly kickoffs to various things and celebrate the people that were doing it. But more important than that, I started doing this. So this is a real slide. And at the end of a quarter, I would basically take every team and I would ask them to list all of the shots that they took and whether or not they were losses, neutral, wins, or big wins. You can see the kind of what it required in order to be in each of those categories. And I would just share this with the team. I'm going to pause. I'm going to let you look at this data, and I'm interested in, when you look at this, what your takeaways are. If you were the leader of a team leading one of these squads, or if you were the kind of overall leader of the product organization, what the number one takeaways are, most interesting insights are from this data. You want to say it again? Large losses. Yep. What else? Team with the most shots also has the most big wins. Yes. 24 losses, but 3 big wins. Yep. What else? Yeah, everyone has some win. This was a super impactful slide for the team, the first quarter that I showed it, for a few reasons. One, team one had focused on, they are the team that had most embraced the velocity approach. And they had generated the insight that effort is not the same as return. And so they had generated all this massive backlog of ideas that were these like really easy things to do, some of which turned out to be massive wins. And so they just started getting their shot rate right up, and it meant that they generated learning faster, and that was really obvious to the whole team as soon as you show something like this up. It also shows how much riskier it is the fewer shots you're taking. You have less chips kind of spread across the table, and so Team 4, even though they took more shots than Team 3, like they didn't find a big winner amongst that. The other thing that like you can't see from here, but I calculated basically the shots that are in the big wins column. When we looked at our company results, what are the things that were generating the most value for the overall organization? 70% of the value being generated came from those big wins. And so you have 4% of the shots that we're taking throughout a quarter generating 70% of the value. And that also helps us understand what our win ratio is, and therefore how many shots that we need to be taking on a regular basis. So we can focus on trying to improve our win ratio and being like, how do we make sure that a shot is more likely to go in the back of the net? And some teams have focused on that, and we've got better at it over time. But every single shot that we took, we had a really strong hypothesis for how it could be a big win. And the fact that only 4% of them turned into that, I think it was all the evidence that I needed to talk to the team and go like, if we're only building one muscle, I trust our ability to build our speed muscle rather than our ability to predict winners. So that's about feedback. So what happened? We got fast. It really it didn't happen overnight, and there were a lot of teething problems along the way. But the team went from, I think prior to this process, we were maybe shipping 2 or 3 things a week from 4 or 5 teams, with maybe 10 or 11 variants. And within 6 months, I think that we got to in the 10 to 20 range of things being shipped a week. Within 12 to 18 months, it was in the 150 to 200 range. And it doesn't really count anymore because we count variants as part of total count. We're in the kind of 200 variants going out in the world and seeing whether or not that was generating value and then deciding whether or not to double down on that. Now we're in the range of actually 60,000 a week because we've automated a bunch of it. So it doesn't really count, but I didn't have time, but I was hoping to actually create a graph of experiment variants over time. But it just looks a bit absurd because now we have 1.5 million live experiments on the site right now, because we were like, oh, it turns out we can automate a bunch of these experiments, and we can just use a bunch of algorithms to actually auto-generate those experiments at different points in ways that apply to different audiences. And that's adding a huge amount of value to users in a way that helps every campaign be more likely to succeed. And the good thing is our team, which at the time was honestly people were frustrated. They weren't delivering a lot of value, and it was not a super exciting place to be. Going through a RIF process of 50% of the team is pretty awful. I expected more people to leave, honestly. I actually budgeted on more people leaving. I was I'm going to plan for attrition because I know that this is an awful experience. But because we started generating value and people started seeing wins, people loved it and they were really excited about it. And it helped generate this sense of momentum that then carried us across that whole process, even though there were some pretty significant ups and downs along the way. And so that was a few years ago. Right now, we are growing quickly, where we basically had 30% quarter-on-quarter growth for 2 years. And we achieved all the goals, and now we're investing again. We're growing the team, and a lot of the things that we did are now like driving some of the kind of biggest political moments that are happening around the world. So this is just a couple of weeks ago. There's like this movement of 5 million people on Change.org that are trying to prevent a bunch of the internet filtering regulations that are kind of taking off in Europe at the moment. This is the campaign to try and get a final say referendum in Britain around Brexit. A newspaper, the Independent newspaper, started a campaign on Change.org that has now more than 1 million supporters, and that has, when they started it, seemed totally absurd, that it might be plausible that there could be another referendum on Brexit, and at this point it seems one of the most likely options, and has consistently turned out hundreds of thousands of people to the streets. And then the Yellow Vests movement in Paris, I'm not sure, or in France, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but it's essentially it's like kind of an started out as a campaign against fuel taxes, but has kind of morphed into an anti-political elite and corruption movement in France more broadly. This started with a campaign on Change.org, and the woman who started that petition is the number one spokesperson for this issue in Paris. And Emmanuel Macron kind of had to signed up as a decision maker on Change.org so that he could start responding to the campaigns because he wanted to try and mitigate it. And so all of these things have added up in a way that now sees us really central to a lot of the different kind of political moments that are happening in the world, and that are helping us power these people-driven movements to have more and more impact. So my high-level summary for you, first, like, be bold in like trying to align your goals. I think this is actually the number one thing that we did, was the decision around the business model. The fact that we could be as clean as we were and what we were trying to solve for enabled everything else. Second, focus. Third, get that alignment. Fourth, create those feedback loops. And I hope that that set of ideas is somewhat valuable for you as you think about how you can grow the velocity and capacity of your team to succeed over time as well. That's what I've got for you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for speaking tonight. You said that you planned on attrition. You planned on people to leave. What if people did leave and all of a sudden now you're shorthanded? What was a backup plan to the backup plan?
Yeah, I think you see it pretty regularly. A company goes through a RIF process, doesn't calibrate properly on the number of people they need, and so then are hiring afterwards, which is a really tough hiring situation. The backup plan was hiring, but that was why when we were trying to work out how to calibrate that, we planned for some level of people to leave. It did make my budgeting harder, but is not the worst problem in the world to have. Yeah, I hope that you never have to go through something like that. But if you do, planning for that so that you're not in the situation where you have to let go a bunch of people and then suddenly have to start hiring again, which is a really bad spot to be in.
Hi, thank you. I'm also with a nonprofit, so that was particularly meaningful. Can you talk a little bit about the role of research and what data you looked at most frequently to make these key decisions along the way?
Yeah, so we're blessed in that we have a lot of traffic, which means that there are some parts of our research process that are easier than many others, because it's pretty, like, I can have an idea and I can have it in front of 5 million people tomorrow. And that gives us a lot of opportunity for quant input. The problem with that is that it can lead you to a situation where you're kind of the dog chasing the tail a little bit. And we've tried to build out over time strong qual and quant research muscles, where we're using the qual more to generate the hypotheses and ideas and like ways of kind of creating value for users better. And then the quant is about validating whether or not those hypotheses are working. So that's kind of at a high level how we've tried to do that. Depending on the problem space that we were working on, we had pretty detailed metrics and funnels. So we got better and better over time of understanding the key drivers, both of user value and business value. This is actually one of the most useful things that we did actually is we simplified our whole site experience into a 10-step flow diagram and built out what the conversion points were and the transition points. And then we turned that into a model. And then we started playing with different parts of that model. And we're like, okay, so step 4 in this flow, if we can increase that by 10%, how does that compound or not across other parts of the site? And that model actually became one of the main decision-making tools for where we would focus, because there is a set of dynamics on our site that when you look at things like viral distribution, because we have a lot of viral distribution, about 60% of our traffic is viral distribution, about 30% is owned, so email or other notification channels. And the final 10%, we don't really know, it's dark. The nature of shifting that viral mechanic is that compounds in really impressive ways because it applies across multiple generations of people rather than just people's experience on site. So focusing in that space as an example helped the average petition grow 30 or 40% larger, helped us then retain 30, 40% more people, even though we were actually only pulling individual levers in a way that would increase by 10% in the actual part of the funnel. So yeah, that's a little bit of a mess of an answer, but does that get to what you're looking for?
When you avalanched, was it as a product design team avalanche, or was it like the whole organization? And how did you deal with maybe, if it wasn't a full company or avalanche, how did you deal with marketing partners or other partners having different priorities?
Yeah. So when we initiated it, so we decided that we needed to do it and rolled it out to the team in a way that they started working on in 4 days. And that was just product design and engineering to start with. And I think that was largely what we needed to succeed. But once that was moving, so we have these big campaigns teams that also own the marketing function, essentially. And so we then tried to get everyone on board with like, hey, just so you know, we're not doing any of the things that we said that we were, and we're all focused in this place, which did generate some consternation. But I think it was the main comment from other parts of the organization was like, well, why don't you just work like this all the time? Because they don't understand the value of the long-term defensive work, you know? And so in some ways, because we were oriented in the like short-term offensive work, everyone was like, well, great, let's just keep doing this. I was like, you don't understand, everything will start breaking. And so that probably made that process a little bit easier. I would say that, you know, that shots on goal approach that I talked about at the start was a story that we told not just to product and engineering. It was a story that we told to the whole organization. And so even though they were working in slightly different ways, that common language gave us a way for people to understand the problem that we were trying to solve in a way that I think made it a lot easier as well.
Thank you so much for giving this talk. It's extremely interesting. So based on your answer to the question about being data-driven and also qualitative-driven, how did you decide to spend time on finding the right tools to measure those types of results and hypothesis finding versus actually implementing something and maybe making assumptions about whether it's working or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think initially we over-indexed on being data-driven rather than being data-informed. And I think that's because it's easy to make a decision when you have the very clear data behind it. And so we needed to, after a few months, maybe even 6 months, I kind of recognized that this was a trap that we were falling into where we would try something and we'd have a little bit of mixed data, whether it was qualitative or quantitative. And like maybe it wasn't an immediate winner, but maybe it laid the groundwork for something else that we thought could be really interesting. And what I wanted us to be able to do at that point was use our judgment to say, like, we're informed by the data. It's not a big loss. Let's just like call it and then like build on top of it. And what initially happened was, because we were really focused on being data driven, people would be like, no, we need to test again. Unless it's a clear winner, we're not actually going to implement anything. And so I think that was a tension that we needed to navigate, and honestly still navigating today. I'm trying regularly to push my team to be like, be data informed, not data driven, and use your judgment. But it's kind of easier for me to do that as the leader of product. And say, well, I'd back my decision here. Whereas if they make a decision that I'm like, well, why did you do that? And they don't have data, then like that's a harder situation. So it's an ongoing thing that we're trying to navigate. But I think that's the goal from my perspective, is to be able to be informed by it, but still use our product judgment and instincts as to whether or not it fits in our strategy or whether or not it creates more value for users based on our own judgment and understanding of what we're doing for them.
Hi, it's great to hear a success story like that. I've been part of larger organizations that have tried to do this sort of thing and not been so successful. And one of the challenges is always to get the whole management team on board. And the way you talk about it, it seems like everybody was happy, but I'm sure there were some nerve-wracking moments. How did you keep the CEO and the other key guys in the company lined up with what you're doing?
So I think this is why I feel partly blessed that this was initiated by an existential crisis. I think that I know that the CEO and various people in the organization wanted us to build this muscle at various points, but that it hadn't happened because there'd been too much inertia or too much like people just pulling in different directions. So I guess my first answer is you never let a good crisis go to waste, and that created the burning platform that then allowed us to be more brutal in some of those decisions than we otherwise would have been. And I'd say if people aren't familiar, I really do subscribe to the change management theory of burning platforms, which is that if you want people to jump from this platform to that one, you don't tell them how good that platform is, you set this one on fire. And so like it's easy for people to give lip service to like, oh yeah, that seems like a great place to go. But here is very comfortable. Here is where everyone has their process built around, and here is like people aren't operating in ambiguity, and they know that they know where they're placed within it. And so getting people to move in a certain direction is actually less about painting the picture of the future, although that's important. It's more about making sure that everyone understands the problems with the present in a way, and they feel those. And so early on, when I did face some of those barriers, that was where I focused, was basically like, how do I kind of bring the pain of our current process and like how that prevents our ability to succeed to people who are not exposed to that, whether that's sitting down next to an engineer while we're going through our deploy process that's like painfully slow, or saying like, no, you need to QA this feature, and that is going to take you 4 days because we don't have a bunch of QA automated. That brings it home in a way that people understand a little bit more. I would say this is not an easy thing that any of you can necessarily immediately influence, but I'm also glad that I didn't have an engineering peer at that time. I was running both product and engineering for the start of this process, and even though I don't have an engineering background, it meant that I was able to set priorities in a more dictatorial way, honestly. That later on we got someone there, and I'm very thankful we have. He's so much better at it than I am. But by then the ship was sailing in a certain direction, and everyone was kind of on board with it. And I think actually executive alignment is probably one of the main reasons that it would succeed or fail. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. You had a slide where all of the teams, with the velocity of each of the teams, it seemed like all of the teams had the same goal or same North Star goal. Is that actually how you set up all of the teams to have the same goal, or is there another way to do it?
No. So good question. Generally what would happen is that on a quarterly basis, we would say, all right, there are 4 levers that we want to pull this quarter. Maybe one is on distribution, maybe one is on an acquisition, and one is on retention. And we know how those roll up to our top level company goals. And so what each team would then get is a goal for that submetric. So the acquisition team would have a goal that was, increase acquisition by 30%, or the retention team would increase activation by 40%, whatever it was. What we made sure is that each team was calibrated on the same, basically had the same high level potential for impact on company goals, no matter what part of the funnel they were operating in. And what that meant is that you could increase activation by 20%, and we knew that that would translate to the top level company goal at a 5% level or something like that. And so that's what each team was actually oriented around. The other thing that I didn't say about that slide is, depending on where you're working, it's easier to have higher velocity or lower velocity. And so part of the dynamic that was up there is also that the team that had taken the most shots were the team that had the most traffic to play with. We had to kind of talk about that and basically say, hey, it's just easier. But also the teams that don't have as much traffic to play with need to get better at building muscles around qualitative feedback, because you can still go through really fast iteration cycles with qualitative feedback, even if you're not able to deal with millions of visitors kind of going through your experiments in a short period of time. And so that slide was from pretty early in the process, before we'd built a stronger qualitative loop muscle. And as time went by, we were able to do more iterations in lower traffic spaces by flexing that qualitative muscle more.
Last question.
Just following up to her question, how were the teams kind of formed? Were they by feature area or infrastructure versus front end? And then how did you go about setting the roadmaps? Each team had a different roadmap, or there was one overarching?
Yeah, so we're basically divided into, during most of this period, 5 feature squads of front-end teams that were full stack, but focused on building features for users or business. And then a bunch of support teams. So we had backend, DevOps, data, platform, and the kind of shot approach was largely focused on the front end teams and the kind of feature teams. But when we did the Avalanche, that was everyone. So we had backend platform team working on features, and that was really interesting because they also then identified a bunch of things that they could improve once they went back to going to platform work. So that's at a high level how that was organized. And then from a roadmap perspective, quarterly OKR process, mixture of top down and bottom up. I would see it as my goal to identify the problem area that they were working, the lever that they were focused on, to work really hard to make sure that that lever didn't have interdependencies with the other team, so that they could have a swim lane that was entirely their own and that they didn't need to talk to anyone else in order to operate within it. And then what would generally happen, and I'm doing this right now for our Q2 goal setting, is that I would come in and be like, so I think at a high level, we need to basically be increasing this metric by 30 to 40% this quarter. And they'd be like, either that's crazy or maybe. And then they'd go through a process of basically saying like, hey, that's, we think that we can go after this, but we need this little bit of extra support, or like, no, that's totally ludicrous. We need to think about some other approach. It's a mixture of top down and bottom up. I would define the problem area and the ambition, and then they would think about like one, validating that ambition and what they needed to achieve it, and then start building the kind of roadmap around it. But we also resisted and continue to resist roadmaps that are more than 4 to 6 weeks long, because we learn too much because of the number of shots that we're taking. And if it's more than 6 weeks, it tends to be a waste of time.
Great, thank you so much.
I feel slightly cheeky about this because I might be undercutting. Why isn't this working? Products that count, but I was going to ask for feedback as well. If you take out your iPhone and point it at that, it will literally open up a link for you right now. Pull out your phones. Just point your camera at it. It's amazing how it works. If you're Android, you need to use that link, unfortunately. I would love your feedback, but also fill out theirs when you get the email.
You'll get that one too.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is we're hiring. We're hiring lots of roles because we're growing really fast. And so whether it's PM or design roles, also looking for like a kind of program management chief of staff type role within, like, to help me run the product team overall. If anyone is interested in any of those, I would love to talk to you. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. So yes, shout outs. Does anybody have shout outs for the group? Go ahead.
Introduce myself. This is my first kind of product, the meetup. So I'm Monal Shah. I'm a senior product manager at Castlight Health. And what we are working on is to help employee population to be healthy and also navigate the complex kind of healthcare system. And recently, with the launch in 2018, we launched a combined platform of 2 companies coming together, and we impacted like 4 million lives.
Any other shout outs?
Yeah. Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Papagno. I've been a product manager at PayPal for 3 years building business products, and now I'm seeking my next challenge in product management, hopefully in the social good and impact space. So if you know of any great opportunities, then let me know. I'll talk to you.
Hi, good evening. This is great. My name is Erika Torres, and my background's actually in behavioral medicine. About 2 years ago, I decided to make a move to product management, and I've been mostly working in health tech and also looking for an opportunity either within health tech or tech for good or like social justice or any of those verticals around education and the environment, what have you. So I'm very excited to be here, and I would love to get to know everyone.
Any others? Nope. Cool. Then let's wrap it up here. Thank you guys so much for coming, and we have the space until for another 30 minutes, so feel free to stay around, mingle, talk with Nick, and I'll see you again next month. So next month we have Christy Gann. She is the VP of Product at Shutterfly, and she's going to be talking a little bit about personalization and what that can do for building products. Thank you very much.